Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 100 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term coaching engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today. I'm very excited to be here. Really pleased to present some data from our latest benchmark study with over 400 companies now in 30 different industries included over the last 14 years on a particularly important topic around how 360s are used. And one of the things that we started finding in our study was some interesting differences when you look at the way 360s are used, in particular in this notion of whether they're being used for development or whether they're being used for performance management. So I want to spend some time today exploring what it looks like when companies make the choice of using 360s for performance management as contrasted to how they might make some same design decisions when they're using 360s for development. As we know, our data, as I mentioned, has been collected over many years, and we've seen some interesting trends in this way. So want to kind of comment and think about the context, but also really get into some of the data from our study and what it's telling us about if you're going to be designing a 360 for performance management, what are some of the decisions that other companies have made when doing that, and so what might it look like and how might that be different, particularly if you've had a development-oriented one to start with. So let's first kind of look a little bit at the context, right? So the great debate, literally back I think to the mid-'80s, there's been this sort of ongoing discussion among professionals and practitioners that use 360s around, should we be using these only for development or should they be also used for talent decisions? There's kind of a classic sort of orientation toward 360s really are a developmental tool only, and we shouldn't be using them for anything else. But then there's also this notion, if you've ever used 360s, especially at a large scale within an organization, you get data on 10,000 managers. Maybe there's something more than just self-directed development that those data could inform. So there's a question about what other kinds of decisions might 360s be used for. Now, we've seen this in some of our recent data. So the last study we did a few years ago, we asked this question of how do you use your results? How do you use your 360 results? And we looked at it, of course, not just as simple as sort of decision making. When you start unpacking a decision, if you will, you find there are kind of different levels or different types of decisions. For example, one could ask the question, if you're using a 360 to guide training decisions, well, is that allocating resources? Is that really, yes, it's development oriented, but is that really more of a decision that could impact somebody's career in a very real way? Not much different, perhaps, than using it to inform succession or promotion, that sort of thing. So when we looked at the data from the past, what we started seeing is this pattern where really only about a third of companies were using 360s in this sort of classically pure sort of self-directed development where here's your report, it's only yours, only you see it, hopefully you'll do something with it. And really about 2/3 were using the tool for some kind of decision making or another. So clearly it's, that while there is a debate, it's maybe waning a little bit in the sense that self-directed approach is starting to give way, and we're starting to see organizations use 360s more and more. As a matter of fact, in our current study, that this number shifts from 37% down to 24%, so the trend may even be kind of continuing. But what this what these data from our previous study started telling us is maybe we want to start digging in a little bit more, and that's kind of the premise for our talk today, is to explore, well, what happens when you make those choices, when you're really using the tool not just for self-directed development, but for sort of decision making. But first, let's spend a little bit of time thinking about kind of what those options look like. So certainly the traditional orientation is more on the left side of this graphic, right? So information only, maybe development planning, self-development, where only the Ray T sees the feedback is kind of what has been sort of pushed out there quite a bit. A lot of literature sort of supports that notion. But really, what happens on the other side of the spectrum here? What happens when you start using it for performance appraisal, for performance assessment, for identifying potential and whatnot? I think the key, though, is to recognize the brilliance, I think, in this notion of continuum, is that it really isn't an either or. Even when we're asking our questions in the benchmark study, it's a little difficult to get it to be sort of an either or distinction. But if we're gonna simplify a little bit and say, all right, well, what's going on the right side of this continuum? First, let's understand a little bit about the context. So what's going on generally, for example, in performance management? Well, recently, in the last few years, you've probably seen a lot of articles, a lot of kind of hubbub, really great. No one really enjoys their performance review. Very rare. So, a headline like, "Please kill the performance review already," is going to get a lot of readers and a lot of attention. And certainly that was the case in the last few years. There were companies like GE and Netflix and Accenture and others who were making the case that they were going to just get rid of performance review and wouldn't be using it at all. So let's do, I'm not going to do per se a live quiz, but just, kind of think about it on your own. So what do you suppose is, that sort of trend and moving in that direction, what do you suppose the percentage was of companies that have sort of adopted this approach of eliminating their formal annual performance review? And again, to be clear, it's not as though they're getting rid of performance review. They're really shifting it into, have the conversation regularly. Don't just have it once a year. Let's not make it this kind of rigid thing. So they are trying to replace it. But what percentage do you suppose? Well, it turns out in a recent study by the Corporate Research Board, they found out that it was really only 6%. So literally 6% of companies are doing this. Not exactly an overwhelming wave. And as a matter of fact, if you start looking at some of the recent literature, it may not be the case that this is exactly moving upward. It may be plateauing or even moving down. And maybe there are just a lot of companies sitting on the sidelines on kind of a wait and see, let's see how their approach goes. But it doesn't seem like this eliminate performance review is going to happen anytime soon. On the other hand, the impetus behind that is still there. So there still is this notion that performance review is somehow not as effective as it could be. So let's think a little bit about what that value of performance is. Why do you do a review? Well, kind of three fundamental things, right? On the one hand, you need to be able to document people's performance. If you need to change somebody's relationship to the company, if somebody's not doing their job, and you need to be able to communicate that to them and move them up and level them up a little bit, get them back to where they're doing the job proficiently, or find a way to move them into a new role either inside or outside the organization, you're going to want some documentation for that and make sure that you're doing that well and doing it properly. The other thing, of course, is allocating rewards. Typically, there's some notion of let's give our higher performers more rewards, and this is a way to encourage high performance. There are a lot of debates about how well it does those, but certainly those two things are key benefits or key values of a performance review. Now this is where it gets interesting, because the other element of many performance reviews is let's provide performance feedback. Let's help the person have some development goals and move themselves forward and from a career progression standpoint, not just the job at hand. And generally, I think if you look at it, this is the component of performance reviews that falls short, right? So really, performance reviews are useful for documentation. You can use it to kind of allocate that small percentage of pay increases that you're going to do every year. But when it comes to providing feedback, it doesn't tend to quite fit the bill. One of the reasons for that, one of the key reasons for that is performance reviews typically come directly from the manager, right? So that's a very limited source of information for providing the feedback. Often that manager has a whole lot of them to do and may not put enough into either collecting the data about the areas that need to be developed or certainly delivering it. So the notion is that this is the part of it that's most broken and perhaps compelling the need to make that shift. So it's kind of a natural fit, if you will, to think that 360s might be a good fit because, frankly, 360s do this best. Allocating rewards, maybe not quite so well. The legal defense, certainly up in the air. But clearly, providing improvement feedback, that is what 360s do quite well. So this seems to be the opportunity where 360s may fit in and where we've seen perhaps a jump and a shift toward, well, hey, instead of some of these more formal, rigid performance reviews that are doing these bottom two things, maybe we can insert 360 into the process to fill that gap. Well, there are some cautions, I would say, in doing that. I think there's great promise, and as we'll see when people start making that shift and the decisions they've made, there are some consequences. So we've done some research that's supported by other meta-analyses even that have found, for example, that when you do this, there's a real shift in ratings. So this is a study that we did a number of years ago where we looked at a bunch of programs that were done for performance review purposes, and then a bunch of programs that were purely for development, could clearly be separated into this sort of a dichotomy. And what we found in just looking at the 360 scores, as you can see here, is that the performance management programs across all the competencies, the ratings were quite a bit higher. Same exact instrument, same exact fundamental process, same group of raters, but the purpose, literally how they were going to use the results, how it was communicated, what the intent was the only difference between these two groups, and we found that the developmental scores were far more far lower and perhaps one could argue more honest. So there was quite a bit of inflation that we saw. Now this result supports some findings from the late 90s by the Jawar and Williams that did this with over 60,000 cases and 22 studies, and they found about a third of a standard deviation increase in scores when being used for performance review as compared to being used for development. So there's some real concerns and lots of reasons why that may be. It could be people don't want to be the bad guy, I don't want to be the one that keeps you from getting that raise. It could be a lot of things. But what we do know is that when purpose changes, the ratings themselves do shift. So there's some caution warranted in terms of being thoughtful about how you structure the process to get that most sort of honest, direct feedback. So with that caution in mind, let's take a look at some of the design decisions that people have made when they use 360s in performance review. So one of the first questions we ask is, what kind of program do you use your 360 for? So do you include your 360 in a coaching program? Do you include it in a formal educational leadership education program like a leadership internal academy, that kind of thing? Are you using it for talent reviews, on-demand development, right? Just you need development, here use this as a diagnostic, or are you including it in a performance review? And what we found in our benchmark study, again, of hundreds of different companies, is that about a third of companies are actually using it for performance management. Interestingly, they're also using it for other purposes. So one of the other findings we had, and I'll show in a minute, is that they're using it for multiple purposes. So just briefly to go through this, when we talked about that coaching, that leadership coaching program, companies that said they were using it in this capacity were responding based on a program they had of systematic coaching, right? So driven by a talent strategy. This is not just every once in a while someone gets coaching. This is, we have a coaching program across the organization, and embedded within it is a 360. Again, about a third use it as part of their formal leadership education program. About a third, again, in talent review, where it's system-wide leadership talent review and succession planning kinds of conversations. And then a big jump, and this seems to be a very common way that folks are using the 360s, is really just non-programmatically, but we have a 360 available when someone needs that kind of feedback and some support around it. We're going to be able to provide that on an ad hoc basis, so about half of them. But then again, about a third using it for performance management. So when we look at performance management, we're talking about a regular systematic review of an employee's performance, typically on an annual basis, often used for, again, pay, promotion, those kinds of decisions. So what we're going to do in this presentation, in this analysis, and we're drawing from some of the findings from our study, is we're going to contrast some of these folks. So what we did is we actually aggregated these first 4 groups into a single group, which we're going to call the development-focused programs. And we're going to compare the way in which those programs design their 360 process to those that did it for performance management, and how did they design their program. So it provides a really interesting contrast to the varying differences. Now, there were lots of different questions we asked, frankly, where there weren't differences, but what we're going to do is highlight the differences that we saw, and I think in the end we'll see sort of a summary that gives a nice kind of encapsulation of where those differences really do lie, and it makes it pretty clear that there is quite a bit of difference in the way one would design a 360, communicate a 360, etc., depending on the different purpose. Okay, so as I go through the data, what I'm going to, so let me also point this out. So we also, when we asked them what the kinds of programs they used, important to note that it wasn't just that they had one program. Companies are incorporating, as a matter of fact, more than half of them use 360s for more than one program type. We, of course, segregate the responses according to their responses for performance management as compared to their responses for other types. But it does seem to be the case that the 360s are used across a broad spectrum of programs, and it's not that it's just a 360 for a program. There are multiple ones that are being used. So when we look at these results, what I'm going to be doing is kind of contrasting and asking this fundamental question. What's the difference when 360 feedback is used as performance management tool? So when you use it as a performance management tool, how does it differ? And we'll compare and contrast. So the first thing that we did is ask kind of what are the ways, what are the kinds of decisions that you use when you're looking at these results? Are you using this to hire, fire people? Are you using this to guide their development? Are you using this to allocate various training resources, etc.? And what we found was there were some pretty interesting differences between the groups. So you can see kind of, if we were to put a normal curve here, you can see this sort of tilt where performance management is clearly more on the right side of that continuum that we saw before, and development focus is clearly more on the left side. So when you're implementing a 360 for coaching, for a leadership academy, that kind of thing, even succession planning, it tends to be more on the development side, less on the, quote, decision-making side. So our fundamental conclusion here is feedback is used more for personnel decisions when you're doing 360s for performance management. So maybe a little bit self-explanatory in some respects, but it is important to recognize the gray in the middle, right? So we have pure personnel decisions on the right. No development-focused programs are using that, not a surprise. Almost 20% of the performance management are using it purely for that purpose. No performance management programs are just using it for self-directed development. But then there's this middle ground, and I think this is a really important thing to recognize, that it isn't a dichotomy, it isn't an either-or. Even if you're using it for performance management, for 360s, they're still fundamentally a developmental tool. So the notion is it isn't either-or. It isn't either we're doing it for performance management or we're doing it for development. If you're using it for performance management, what we're seeing is, yes, you're using it for personnel decisions, but you're also using it for development. And that's what we saw in our next question as well. So we try to kind of get a little bit more granular and say, well, more specifically, how do you use it? What specific kinds of things do you link your 360 to? And when we ask that question, what we find is, again, this trend toward clearly, about 4/5 of the companies are using the 360s for development. Even the ones that are performance management see that there's a developmental component. So this goes back to the slide, this notion that by using 360s in their performance management process, they're filling the gap. that we saw before. They're seeing it as effective for development, for career development, but when you use it for performance management, you see down lower in the slide there, the indirect link to pay, direct link to pay, those are huge shifts up in terms of the way the information is being used. So again, here I think we see the yes and. So again, bottom line conclusion, when you use 360s, it is used for performance management. It is used for pay and promotion. But again, I want to emphasize it's a yes and, right? So it's feedback's used for pay, promotion, and development is really what we're seeing. All right, so let's think about now kind of levels. So the other interesting difference, when you do 360s, you tend to find, they're often used at a higher level, a little bit more executive. Performance management, of course, is something you want to do across the organization. So when we ask the question, what level does your 360 process target? What we're seeing here is that the levels are quite different. So again, that you can see that tilt for development focused on executives, leaders, but when you start getting lower in the organization, managers, individual contributors, or even all employees, very difficult to do a developmentally focused 360 for all employees. So this is a case where 360s now become available to a much broader set of employees when you're using them for performance management. So again, that tilt toward perhaps a lower level employee gets now access to their 360, whereas with a developmentally focused, it tends to be more of a leadership or management tool. So our conclusion here, again, is more lower level employees get feedback. It'll be interesting when you start getting into some of the content what the kind of quality or character of that feedback is, but clearly more of the feedback is being used across a broader percentage of the organization. Volume goes way up. So let's talk about content, though. What is that survey measuring? If you're using it for performance management, what exactly is it measuring? And this is one of the more, I think was one of the more interesting questions across the study. One of my favorite findings here is the fact that in both cases, 0% of the companies use it to measure personality. As a behavioral psychologist, that makes a lot of sense to me. It ought to be a tool used to observe behaviors, give feedback about behaviors. Not that personality isn't a valuable tool, but that's a self-report tool that maybe gets a little bit of some of the kind of underlying factors that are influencing that behavior, but fundamentally what you're trying to do is change behavior. So when we look at the two different programs differentially here, we find performance management tends to be much more focused on job-specific performance. Still there'll be some behaviors, but with 360s that are developmentally focused, it's clearly a behavioral tool and some job-specific performance. In the case of performance management, that just sort of flips. Behaviors are there, but the job-specific performance is really coming to the fore a little bit more. Now this has all kinds of implications for what you're doing. If your survey content is job specific, and you're doing it across all employees, you're going to need more forms. You're going to need more different types of surveys based on the different areas and functions. And surely there can be some kind of generic questions. Overall, how would you rate this person's performance? You might get some generic things like follow through or meeting deadlines or those kinds of things that need to happen across multiple different tasks. But you do need to be thoughtful that if you start switching into job-specific survey content, you're going to really have to tailor it more specifically to the jobs, and that can get very granular and increase the complexity of your program quite a bit. The other challenge in doing this from an organizational standpoint, from, for example, a talent review standpoint, is if you have job-specific surveys, it becomes more difficult to aggregate across the company. So it's very much more difficult to look at kind of what behaviors emerge as ones that we're really effective at and ones that we might need to develop more broadly when you've got multiple different job types and questions. So again, fundamentally the conclusion that we get here is when you do performance management 360s, the surveys are going to focus more on job performance. So being aware of that just tends to be sort of a typical pattern. The other area that they might vary by has to do with the level. So again, what level of your is your survey content targeted? So is the survey content targeted at different for individual contributors, say, than it is for executives, or is it the same across? So in a developmentally focused, you can see the same by all participants is much, much more common than the performance management where you rarely are using the same instrument across. And so what's happening here is we're seeing in the developmental focus, there may be some differentiation, but it's less by job type or task and more by level. So you might, at the executive level, you might have more on strategy or negotiating or something along those lines than at a lower level. Or, for example, you might have team leadership at a top level but being a team player at a lower level. And that would be a kind of a common differentiation. In performance management, the level and job are kind of blended across. It's sort of a little bit of everything in terms of whether the content is varying by level. But again, I think just pointing out some of the complexity that you've got when you go into a performance management, you're really trying to tailor it to that individual. When they vary by job task and they vary by job level, you can end up with quite a few different survey forms that you're considering. So again, surveys are much more, if you're doing performance management 360s, you've got to really take some time to look at how do we want to deal with this issue of different by level, different by job. You could get it really granular to every single job, but there are organizations that have literally thousands of job types and job titles. So you got to be kind of, draw lines there somewhere. Is it job families, et cetera? But going to be some differentiation there, which on the developmental side you're less likely to need because you're going to be tending to focus more on core behaviors that you're trying to drive across the organization, that sort of thing. Another interesting component of or differentiation when it comes to content has to do with length. So we've seen a trend over time where survey length has started to kind of decline, and not super surprising. Certainly, there's lots of pressure from executives to do, shorter, quicker, faster, easier. But there's this balancing act between, well, yes, we can do it shorter, quicker, faster, but we may overlook some pretty significant portions of the job or the leadership's role. So what's that kind of balance between quick and easy and thorough and complete? What we've seen here, and so in the past we actually didn't split the data out by program type, and it helps start to sort of explain a little bit of the findings that we were seeing in past surveys. When we take a look at it, we realize that really survey length is quite a bit different. So you see that the developmental focused surveys tend to be longer. Performance management tend to be shorter, and in some cases extremely short, 10 or less items. Almost half the performance management surveys are 10 or less. So that's a pretty big shift, very hard to cover specific, clear behaviors at that level. More than likely these instruments are covering kind of more broad, kind of generalized competencies, looking for a broader kind of rating. So this to me is a positive trend and a good explanation, because I think in general, if you've done developmentally focused feedback, you realize that the granularity and the specificity in some of those items is really, really quite critical. So you take an item or a competency like communication, for example. You can say, well, we want communication to be a really short, punchy question. Okay, great. So communicates clearly and concisely. Okay, there you go. That's it. That's our communication item. Well, that sounds great, but what about listens effectively or shares information or these kinds of things? So the notion being that communication is actually a little bit more complex than a single item. And so when you start unpacking some of the complexities of leadership and behavior that are measured by instruments like this, particularly if you're trying to fine-tune your development, it may be better to have a little bit longer survey. I will say I cut it off at the 100. It used to be years ago, you saw all kinds of 360s in the 120, 130 item range. Just not feasible, and that seems to be really fading regardless of program type. So really the sweet spot we're seeing in here is somewhere in that kind of 40 to 70 range, and the average containing the extremes really is around 19 for the performance management, and quite a bit larger, but still right on that cusp for the development focused. So again, if you're using 360s for performance management, surveys are likely to be short and perhaps extremely short, so be intentional about the way you set that one up. Another shift that we've seen is related to who's providing feedback. So one of the great ways to mess up 360 feedback is to not provide the right raters, right? Well, I'm going to include all my direct reports, but I think I'll exclude the ones that are poor performers. That's going to change your feedback. So looking at who's selecting the raters is a pretty critical piece. What we find when we compare the two is there, again, is a pretty big shift here. So in performance management, it's going to be manager, HR, perhaps right off the HRIS, HR and manager, very rarely the participant only. But you can see even just in the contrast there, a quarter of the development-focused programs, maybe again that 24% where it's the self-directed development, it's the participant that picks the raters. They can do the friends and family plan. With performance management, maybe you want those poor performers in your direct report group included in the data set. So you can see a pretty big shift here in terms of the way companies are tending to bias toward fundamentally more involvement from HR, more involvement from the manager, as you would expect when you think about those bottom two values of performance management. If we're allocating rewards and we're thinking about legal risk, we're probably going to involve a manager in HR. If we're just trying to provide performance feedback, well then maybe we're going to involve the participant a little bit more. So somewhat of a logical shift here. Bottom line being, if you're using performance management 360, it's going to involve the HR and the boss, and they're probably going to be involved in some way in choosing the raters and who's providing feedback. Again, trying to make sure that that feedback is accurate. Now, training raters, interesting space. A lot of research shows that rater training is highly effective at improving accuracy, one of the best sort of levers we have at improving accuracy, which improves your reliability and your validity. So differences in the way these two programs train raters. Interestingly, some form of rater training is actually pretty common across. So there could be multiples here. Someone might include text in the survey and email and do some web-based training. But what we do see is that in general, that in-person training, which is what most of the rater training research is founded in, is the thing that is clearly more common with performance management. Almost all of them realize the simplicity of putting some clear instructions in the text of the survey itself, and then obviously the email as well, really helpful there. But more, and the other thing is we're seeing more training from performance management oriented programs that may perhaps greater level of scrutiny on accuracy that we know rater training provides, but more training but also more likely to be live. So again, raters are more likely to be trained in person when you're doing performance management 360. Another key component, who receives a report? It's that sort of, well, you told me it was for development only, but then you gave my manager the report. So how does that work? I think thinking about where the data go is a really critical way to think about intent and purpose. And what we find is, again, some pretty big differences here. So, there are some remarkable shifts here in terms of that report's going to more people. Performance management, we're going to distribute it to the participant, but also the manager, also HR. It's something that's kind of level set for everybody. There are conversations going on around it. Although it's not universal, really, a quarter of the programs, the participants not even getting the feedback. In fact, we've actually implemented a few programs where the 360 is really being used just to inform the manager as they do their more traditional review. So there's another way to kind of augment the performance management with a 360, but it's really focused on improving the manager's data. In any case, clearly with the development-focused programs, it tends to be less likely. The direct manager is involved to some degree, and in some cases the HR is as well, but really it's going to be the participant when you're doing a developmental program Not real clear, frankly, on the 12% of the development-focused programs that aren't involving the participant. A little bit of a strange choice, but I suspect if we were to dig down into the details, we'd find a kind of particular usage that they're using it for. Perhaps a coach is getting the data and informing them that way. So again, fundamentally, when you're using it for performance management, it's pretty clear that HR is involved, HR is engaged in that performance management process, and really it's HR and the manager is going to own the results. Participants are also likely to get a copy, but there's no pretense that it's not also being a critical HR process. Now, this is an interesting finding as well, I think. So one of the kind of key elements of 360's going back through the end of time is around anonymity. And one of the key ways that you protect a respondent's anonymity is that you don't aggregate up their results unless you have at least 3, 4, 5 raters, something along those lines. So that if there's only one respondent and they put their results are displayed, it's going to be pretty clear what that person said. And often it's the case that managers sort of find out just in the kind of water table or water cooler conversations. Oh yeah, did you fill that survey out? Or oh, sorry, I didn't get to fill your survey out. So it's often the case that the managers or leaders getting their feedback know kind of who did the survey and who didn't. So if you only have one person displayed in the report and the manager knows who it was, anonymity is gone. Typically what we found is that minimum of 3 is kind of most common, but we find an interesting difference when you look at the two groups. So there is, the percentage of companies that have no minimum, so however many raters you pick is fine, is quite a bit larger for the performance management. In fact, when you cut across the no minimum or minimum of 2, you find half the performance management programs are just happy with that and they're fine, but very few of the development-focused programs are going to be willing to report data separately. One thing I would say about this is that if you're going to report data that is on the basis of 2 raters or even 1 rater, make sure it's clear to the person responding to the survey that that's the threshold you set, so that they have the opportunity to choose to kind of opt in or opt out of that level of anonymity. Well, in any case, broad conclusion here is anonymity is just less important for performance management. There's less of a premium put on it. It just tends to be less common. Again, I think as long as you're clear kind of what are the rules of engagement, so that respondent is not assuming that it's going to be anonymous and then finding out later it's not, that's fine. But again, it tends to be a little bit less of an issue with the performance management than, say, the development focused. Okay, last, and this was a very interesting finding, we asked folks what their sense was of how much trust there was in the process. And we were able to actually do an analysis, a comparison here, and find a statistically significant difference between the two groups that illustrated that the developmental focused programs had statistically more trust from the employees than the performance management programs. Now, to be honest, I would love both of these to go up about a full point, right? I think gaining trust is a really critical component of any program like this. What I would say is that in general, what we find is that the first year is a whole lot different than the second year. That once people get used to and comfortable with the way 360s are used, it becomes very much just part of the program and very familiar, and trust goes way up. But either way, be aware that there's likely to be less trust in that performance management process, and therefore you're going to have to do more to kind of gain that trust and assure you're getting accurate data. So more on communication, more on transparency. Just recognize that there's going to be a downward pressure on trust because they're going to have less trust kind of right out of the gate. Okay, that was a whole lot of data really fast. I do recommend you take a look at the study. All these graphs and data and a lot more are in there. But I did want to kind of pull it all together in one page, and I think when you see it kind of side by side, it really does sort of stand out that there are pretty large differences. And so I think the big message here is that you really want to look at your purpose and recognize that the purpose for the program is going to change the way you want to do your 360 process. And really, as you're, if you're looking at doing a performance management 360, make sure that you're addressing each of these differences in pretty critical and careful ways, because I think you're going to find a pretty big shift if you try to just use that developmental 360 and port it right over. Probably not going to work. You're going to need to look at some of these shifts and communicate about them in ways that are clear. So I always like, especially in a talk like this where we've got lots of different data points, to see what's one thing. What's that kind of one boiled down? If you boil it down, what is that kind of the one thing? And I guess what I would say with that is that we need to be prepared that 360s being used for performance management is not an if, it's a when. It's going to help fill some of those gaps. There's some good reasons to do it. If you do it well, that's fine. So rather than spending our time arguing about should we or shouldn't we, let's start looking more carefully at the best practices and how can we do it well to achieve the goals that we've set out without losing the key value. We saw with our data from before, the ratings can get inflated. What can we do to change our process to bring those ratings down and make them more equitable from an accuracy and a reliability standpoint? So those are my data. I know Jesse wanted to talk a little bit about more about the study, and then we've got some time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dale. I've got some great questions here, but first I wanted to remind everyone that complimentary electronic copies of the study are available. The electronic copy isn't printable, but you can get a printed, affordable copy on Amazon. We hope you'll join us again in November for our next webinar, Data-Driven Coaching, Leveraging 360 Results to Jumpstart the Coaching Process. We'll be sharing how and why companies are incorporating 360s into their internal coaching programs, how to leverage 360 feedback to target development actions, and how to increase accountability through ongoing coaching.